The moment Adrian Vaughn saw another man touch Claire Bennett's hand, he realized something terrifying. He had already fallen in love with her. Rain streaked across the glass walls of Vaughn Global's 42nd floor boardroom, while Manhattan glowed cold and silver beneath the stormy night sky. Inside, the final executive meeting of the quarter dragged past 9 p.m., the air thick with tension, expensive cologne, and exhaustion. Adrian Vaughn sat at the head of the obsidian conference table like a man carved from ice, his charcoal suit flawless, his expression unreadable. Billionaire. CEO. The man business magazines called untouchable. Employees whispered that he never smiled twice in the same week. And tonight, he looked especially dangerous. The Tokyo acquisition closes Friday, one executive said nervously. Legal still needs your approval. Adrian barely looked up from the documents in front of him. Then why are you still sitting here instead of fixing it? Silence swallowed the room instantly. Nobody challenged Adrian Vaughn. Nobody even breathed too loudly around him. At the far end of the table, Claire Bennett quietly slid a fresh cup of black coffee beside his hand before he even asked for it. 2 sugars. Exactly 140 degrees. She always remembered. Adrian didn't thank her. He never did. Claire simply returned to her seat, tucking a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear as she continued typing notes onto her tablet. Calm. Efficient. Invisible. At least that was what Adrian had convinced himself she was for the past 3 years. Just his executive coordinator. Just another employee. Nothing more. Then the elevator doors opened. Sorry I'm late, a familiar voice said smoothly. Lucas Hale walked into the room carrying Rain on the shoulders of his navy coat and confidence in his smile. Investors loved Lucas. Women definitely did. He shook hands around the room before his attention landed on Claire. Bennett, he said warmly. You saved my life with those contract revisions. Claire laughed softly. Pretty sure your lawyers did most of the work. No, Lucas replied, stepping closer to her chair. That was all you. Adrian's pen stopped moving. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. But something sharp twisted unexpectedly in his chest as Lucas leaned down slightly toward Claire, lowering his voice like they shared a private world no one else belonged to. Then Claire smiled. Not the polite corporate smile she gave clients. A real one. Bright enough to change the entire atmosphere of the room. Adrian suddenly forgot what the meeting was about. His jaw tightened slowly. The city lights reflected against the storm-dark windows behind him, while Lucas continued talking to her like Adrian didn't exist. You still owe me a drink after surviving that investor dinner, Lucas teased. Claire shook her head with a quiet laugh. I said maybe. That sounds promising. Adrian closed the file in front of him harder than necessary. The sound cracked through the boardroom like thunder. Every head turned instantly. If everyone's finished socializing, Adrian said coldly, some of us are trying to run a company. Claire's smile vanished immediately. Lucas straightened, surprised by the sudden tension. Right, he muttered. Sorry. Adrian didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Claire for one long second too many. She looked confused. Hurt, maybe? But she lowered her gaze and continued typing quietly. The rest of the meeting passed in suffocating silence. 40 minutes later, the executives scattered toward the elevators like survivors escaping a storm. Claire remained behind, organizing files into perfect stacks while the skyline shimmered beyond the rain-streaked glass. Adrian stood near the windows, loosening his tie slightly, trying to ignore the unfamiliar irritation burning beneath his skin. You should head home, Claire said gently without looking up. You've been here almost 14 hours. Adrian glanced toward her. She was exhausted too. He noticed the faint shadows under her eyes for the first time. The way she rubbed her wrist when she thought nobody was watching. How her heels sat abandoned beneath her desk because her feet hurt after another endless day. Strange. After 3 years, why was he suddenly noticing everything? Claire slipped on her coat and reached for her bag. Good night, Mr. Vaughn. Then her phone buzzed. Lucas Hale's name lit up the screen. Adrian saw it from across the room. Claire smiled faintly at the message before typing a response. And for reasons he could not explain, jealousy hit Adrian Vaughn so hard it felt almost like fear. Adrian did not sleep that night. The penthouse overlooking Central Park remained silent except for the ticking of the antique clock near the fireplace, and the distant sound of rain against the windows. At 2:13 in the morning, he stood alone in his kitchen wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, staring at the untouched glass of bourbon in his hand. His mind replayed the same image over and over again. Claire smiling at Lucas Hale. It should not have mattered. She was an employee. Smart. Reliable. Easy to work with. That was all. Adrian had built his entire life on discipline and control. Emotions complicated things. Attachments weaken people. He learned that lesson young. His father spent years destroying their family one affair at a time while his mother pretended not to notice until pretending finally broke her. Adrian still remembered hearing her cry through the walls of their Connecticut mansion when he was 16 years old. Money could buy silence. It could buy houses and lawyers and polished smiles at charity galas. But it could not make people stay loyal. Years later, his ex-wife proved the same thing. Beautiful. Sophisticated. Perfect for magazine covers. She loved the Vaughn name more than she ever loved him. When she left, she told him something he never forgot. You do not know how to love anyone, Adrian. You only know how to own things. Since then, he buried himself inside work. Work never lied. Work never abandoned him. Numbers made sense. Companies made sense. People did not. Yet somehow Claire Bennett had quietly slipped past every wall he spent years building around himself. And the worst part was that he had not even noticed it happening. The next morning, Vaughn Global buzzed with the low hum of keyboards, espresso machines, and hurried footsteps across polished marble floors. Adrian walked through the executive level with his usual cold precision, employees immediately straightening when they saw him coming. Good morning, Mr. Vaughn. Morning, sir. He acknowledged nobody. But the moment he stepped into his office, his eyes automatically moved toward Claire's desk outside the glass partition. Empty. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Where is Claire? He asked sharply. His assistant from legal looked startled. She is downstairs helping prepare the investor presentation with Mr. Hale. Adrian loosened his tie slightly. I did not approve changes to today's schedule. Claire said it was more efficient this way. Efficient. Of course it was. Claire always anticipated problems before anyone else even noticed them. 10 minutes later, Adrian entered conference room B and immediately saw her standing beside Lucas near the presentation screens. Claire wore a cream-colored blouse beneath a fitted gray blazer, her hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. Simple. Elegant. Dangerous without even trying. Lucas leaned against the table beside her while she reviewed documents. You saved me again, Lucas said with a grin. At this point I might have to steal you from Vaughn Global. Claire laughed softly. I am pretty sure kidnapping violates corporate policy. Adrian stopped walking. Something dark flickered behind his expression. Mr. Vaughn, Claire said quickly when she noticed him. We were just reviewing the Singapore projections. Adrian's gaze stayed on Lucas. I can see that. The room temperature seemed to drop instantly. Lucas straightened slightly. Relax, Adrian. I was only borrowing her expertise. Borrowing her. The words hit harder than they should have. Adrian stepped closer slowly, his voice calm in the way that usually terrified people most. Claire already has more than enough responsibilities here. Claire blinked in confusion. Actually, I told Mr. Hale I could help. Adrian finally looked at her then. Really looked at her. The faint tiredness beneath her eyes. The coffee cup in her hand she had not finished because she was too busy fixing everyone else's problems. The tiny silver necklace she wore every day that he somehow recognized without ever consciously noticing before. Claire had been beside him through every brutal merger, every sleepless quarter, every public scandal. She stayed late without complaint. She remembered his medication when he forgot. She fixed disasters before they reached his desk. And somehow another man was the first one making her laugh lately. Adrian felt something dangerous unravel quietly inside him. Because for the first time in years, losing someone suddenly felt possible. And he hated it. By Friday afternoon, the tension inside Vaughn Global had become impossible to ignore. Employees lowered their voices whenever Adrian Vaughn walked past. Meetings ended faster. Nobody lingered near his office longer than necessary. Even the senior executives exchanged nervous looks whenever Claire Bennett entered the room because somehow the billionaire CEO, who usually remained calm under billion-dollar pressure, had become unpredictable overnight. Claire noticed it too. Adrian interrupted her more often. Corrected details that did not need correcting. Asked where she was going, who she was meeting, how long she would be downstairs. None of it sounded unreasonable on paper, yet something about his tone felt different now. Sharper. Personal. Late Friday evening, the office floor had mostly empty when Claire finally leaned back in her chair with a tired sigh. The digital clock on her computer read 8:47 p.m. Another 14-hour day. Her neck ached from staring at spreadsheets, and her heels sat abandoned beneath her desk again. Across the glass wall of Adrian's office, she could still see him working beneath the dim city lights, his tie loosened slightly, one hand resting against his jaw while reviewing financial reports. Sometimes Claire wondered if the man ever truly stopped carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. She stood quietly and walked toward the small executive kitchen. A few minutes later she returned carrying a mug of ginger tea. Adrian barely looked up when she entered. "You are still here," he muttered distractedly. "So are you," Claire replied softly as she placed the tea beside him. "Your stomach has been bothering you all week." Adrian's eyes shifted toward the cup. Ginger tea. No sugar. Exactly the way he drank it when stress kept him awake for days. "You remembered." The words escaped before he could stop them. Claire smiled faintly. "I remember everything around here. It is basically my job." Something about that answer bothered him more than it should have. Because she said it like none of those small things mattered. Like staying late every night for him was normal. Like noticing when he skipped meals or forgot medication or looked exhausted was simply part of her schedule. Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her in the quiet office. "Why do you do that?" Claire blinked. "Do what?" "Take care of everyone." She gave a small shrug. "Somebody has to." Adrian watched her for a long moment. Most people around him wanted something. Money. Access. Influence. Claire never asked for anything. Not promotions. Not attention. Not favors. She simply showed up every single day and carried half the company on her shoulders without complaint. His phone buzzed suddenly on the desk. Before Adrian could reach for it, Claire's own phone lit up at the same time. Lucas Hale. Again. Adrian's expression darkened instantly. Claire glanced at the message and laughed softly under her breath. "What?" Adrian asked before he could stop himself. Claire looked surprised by the question. "Nothing. Lucas sent a picture of the investor dinner disaster from Wednesday." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You seem to enjoy talking to him." Silence. Claire tilted her head slightly, clearly caught off guard by the tone in his voice. "He is easy to talk to." Adrian looked away toward the glowing Manhattan skyline outside his office windows. Easy to talk to. The words echoed unpleasantly inside his chest. He had spent years building walls so high nobody could reach him, and now another man walked into a room and made Claire laugh effortlessly within minutes. It irritated him in ways he could not explain. Claire stepped closer to his desk carefully. "Are you upset with me?" Adrian looked back at her immediately. The concern in her eyes hit harder than any accusation could have. "No," he said quietly. "I am upset with myself." Claire frowned slightly, confused by the answer. But before she could ask anything else, thunder rolled across the city outside and suddenly every light in the executive floor flickered once before going completely dark. The office fell silent except for the rain hammering against the windows. Claire inhaled softly. Please tell me your terrifying billionaire building has backup power. Somewhere in the darkness, Adrian actually smiled for the first time in days. The emergency backup lights finally flickered on 30 seconds later, washing the executive floor in a soft amber glow instead of the usual bright white glare. The storm outside had grown heavier, rain sliding down the massive windows while thunder rolled above Manhattan like distant drums. Claire exhaled quietly and pressed a hand against her chest. For a second I thought we were going to die in a billionaire horror movie. Adrian leaned against the edge of his desk, watching her with an expression softer than usual. You are very dramatic for someone who handles corporate disasters every day. Claire smiled faintly. Corporate disasters usually come with spreadsheets, not lightning. The corner of Adrian's mouth moved again. Another almost smile. Strange how easily she pulled reactions out of him now. Claire glanced toward the windows. Looks like nobody is leaving anytime soon. Adrian followed her gaze. Traffic below crawled through the storm, headlights blurred by rain and fog. The roads are flooded downtown, he said quietly. You should wait until it clears. Claire nodded slowly before rubbing her temples with tired fingers. Adrian noticed immediately. Headache? Just tired. She tried smiling again, but this time it looked weaker. Adrian studied her for a moment too long. Sit down. Claire blinked. What? That was not a suggestion. She laughed softly under her breath before lowering herself carefully onto the leather sofa near the windows. Adrian disappeared briefly into the private kitchen beside his office. When he returned, he carried a bottle of water and 2 small white tablets. Claire looked genuinely surprised. Are those painkillers? Adrian handed them to her. You keep them in my desk drawer. 3rd compartment on the left. Silence. Claire stared at him. You noticed that? Adrian immediately looked irritated with himself for answering honestly. You notice everything about everyone else. It would be difficult not to notice eventually. Claire swallowed quietly as she accepted the water from his hand. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Somehow the tiny contact lingered longer than it should have. Outside, lightning flashed across the skyline while the office remained wrapped in warm shadows and silence. For the first time in years, Adrian did not hate silence. Not when she was there. Claire leaned back against the sofa after taking the medicine. Can I ask you something? Depends. Why have you been angry every time Lucas talks to me? Adrian's expression froze instantly. Claire regretted the question the moment the silence stretched too long between them. Forget it, she murmured. I should not have asked. I am not angry, Adrian said finally, though even he did not sound convinced. Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. Yesterday you almost gave the entire finance department a heart attack because Lucas complimented my presentation. Adrian looked away toward the storm outside. He distracts you from work? Claire laughed softly in disbelief. That is your excuse? Adrian remained silent. Because the truth sounded dangerous now. The truth was that every time Lucas smiled at her, Adrian felt something ugly and unfamiliar tighten inside his chest. The truth was that hearing another man make Claire laugh ruined his concentration for hours afterward. The truth was that he had started searching for her the moment he walked into every room. Claire watched him carefully from the sofa. You know, she said gently, people are terrified of you lately. Adrian gave a dry laugh. That sounds normal. No, Claire replied softly. Not like this. Her voice carried something deeper underneath it now. Concern. Adrian slowly loosened his tie completely and sat across from her for the first time all evening instead of towering above her like a CEO addressing an employee. The storm dimmed the city around them until it felt like they existed alone in the entire building. Do you want to know the truth? He asked quietly. Claire nodded once. Adrian looked at her for several long seconds before speaking. I do not like feeling replaced. Claire frowned slightly. Replaced? Adrian's jaw tightened. The word itself tasted bitter. You spend more time with him lately. You smile more around him. Claire stared at him in stunned silence. And for the first time since she started working for Adrian Vaughn 3 years ago, she realized the coldest man in New York might actually be jealous. Claire could not stop thinking about his words. Even after the storm faded past midnight, and the city lights sharpened again beneath the wet Manhattan streets, the tension between them remained suspended in the quiet executive office like something alive. Adrian Vaughn was jealous. The realization felt impossible. Men like Adrian did not get jealous. They controlled rooms. They controlled billion-dollar markets. They controlled themselves. Yet tonight he sat across from her in loosened sleeves and shadows, looking less like the most powerful man in New York and more like someone struggling against feelings he did not understand. Claire tucked a strand of hair behind her ear carefully. "You think Lucas is replacing you?" Adrian let out a humorless laugh. "That is not what I said." "Then what are you saying?" Silence stretched between them again. Adrian stood abruptly and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. 42 floors below, headlights reflected against rain-soaked streets while the storm clouds slowly drifted east. Claire watched the rigid line of his shoulders beneath the soft amber lighting. Even exhausted, the man carried tension like armor. "I am saying," Adrian replied quietly, "that things feel different lately." Claire frowned slightly. "Different how?" Adrian slipped one hand into his pocket, staring at his own reflection in the glass instead of turning toward her. "You leave work smiling at your phone." Claire blinked in surprise. "You noticed that?" "Apparently I noticed too much now." His honesty hit her harder than she expected. Adrian Vaughn barely noticed birthdays, holidays, or office gossip. Yet somehow he noticed her smiles, her phone calls, her moods. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, suddenly nervous in a way she had never felt around him before. "Lucas is just being friendly." Adrian nodded once, but the tightness in his jaw remained. "Friendly men do not look at women like that." The words came out colder than he intended. Claire stared at him quietly. "And how does he look at me?" Adrian finally turned around then. Their eyes met across the dim office. "Like he wants something more." Claire's heartbeat stumbled unexpectedly beneath his gaze. For a moment neither of them moved. Neither looked away. Then Claire laughed softly, almost to break the tension herself. "You know what is strange?" Adrian said nothing. "I spent 3 years thinking you barely saw me." Something flickered across his face instantly. Regret, maybe? Claire stood slowly from the sofa and walked closer to him, stopping only a few feet away. "You never asked about my life. You barely took lunch breaks. Half the time I thought you forgot I existed unless a meeting was late." Adrian's expression darkened slightly. "That is not true." "Is it not?" Claire asked gently. Adrian looked at her carefully then, and suddenly memories hit him all at once. Claire asleep at her desk after 70-hour work weeks. Claire standing beside him during press scandals while everyone else panicked. Claire quietly replacing the coffee in his office every morning before he arrived because she knew he worked better when routines stayed consistent. Claire laughing once in the elevator at a terrible joke he barely remembered making. God. She had always been there. And somehow he had spent years pretending that did not matter. Adrian stepped closer before he even realized he was moving. "I saw you," he said quietly. Claire's breath caught slightly. "Then why did it always feel like I was invisible?" Adrian looked down briefly, struggling with words that did not come naturally to him. "Because if I started letting myself need people..." He stopped there. Claire watched him carefully. "You were afraid." Adrian gave a faint bitter smile. "I do not usually hear that word associated with me. Maybe because nobody knows you well enough to say it." The office fell silent again except for the soft hum of backup generators and rain tapping faintly against the windows. Adrian stared at her for several seconds before speaking in a lower voice. "Lucas asked you to dinner tonight, did he not?" Claire blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "Because he spent the entire week looking at you like a man making plans." Claire crossed her arms slowly. "And why exactly does that bother you so much?" Adrian opened his mouth to answer. But for the first time in years, Adrian Vaughn realized the truth was far too dangerous to say out loud. Claire barely slept after that night. Even 12 hours later, Adrian's voice still echoed inside her mind every time she tried to focus on work. Friendly men do not look at women like that. The words had not sounded possessive. They sounded personal. And somehow that made them far more dangerous. Monday arrived cold and gray over Manhattan. Vaughn Global prepared for its annual charity gala, one of the largest events in the city's corporate calendar. Investors, politicians, media executives, celebrities. Everyone important would be there. By noon, the executive floor buzzed with stylists, security teams, assistants carrying garment bags, and event coordinators speaking into headsets. Claire moved through the chaos with practiced calm, balancing schedules and last-minute disasters the same way she always did. But today felt different. Every time she looked up, she caught Adrian watching her. Not casually. Not professionally. Watching her like he was trying to solve something impossible. Around 5:30 that evening, Claire stood alone in the executive conference room reviewing seating charts when the door opened behind her. "You are still working?" Adrian's deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Claire looked over her shoulder. Adrian had already changed for the gala. Black tuxedo. Crisp white shirt. Dark tie loosened slightly at the collar. The city lights glowing behind him somehow made him look even more dangerously handsome than usual. Claire forced herself to focus on the paperwork instead. "Unlike billionaires, the rest of us cannot terrify people into finishing tasks for us." Adrian walked slowly toward her. "You think I terrify people?" Claire gave him a look. "Last week an intern dropped an entire tray of coffee because you said good morning too seriously." To her surprise, Adrian actually laughed quietly. The sound caught her off guard because it was real this time. Unforced. Warm. For a moment the tension between them softened into something almost normal. Then his eyes drifted over her black evening dress hanging beside the conference table. Simple satin. Elegant without trying too hard. Adrian's expression changed instantly. "You are wearing that tonight?" Claire glanced at the dress. "That was the plan." Adrian looked away too quickly. "It is distracting." Silence. Claire stared at him in disbelief before a slow smile touched her lips. "Mr. Vaughn," she said carefully, "are you flirting with me?" Adrian looked genuinely offended by the accusation. "I do not flirt." "Right," Claire murmured. "You just glare at men and interrogate my evening plans." Adrian stepped closer until only the conference table separated them. "Are you going to dinner with Lucas after the gala?" Claire crossed her arms slowly. "Why do you keep asking me that?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Because he wants more than dinner." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken again beneath his gaze. "And if he does?" Adrian went silent. The air between them suddenly felt too small. Too warm. Before he could answer, Claire's phone buzzed against the table. Lucas Hale. Adrian saw the name immediately. Something dark flashed behind his eyes before he looked away toward the windows. "You should answer it," he said coldly. Claire hesitated. "Adrian, answer your phone, Claire." The way he said her name made her chest ache unexpectedly. She picked up the call slowly. "Hi, Lucas." Adrian turned his back toward her instantly, but she could still see the tension in his shoulders. "Tonight is going to be chaos," Lucas said cheerfully through the speaker. "So I figured I would rescue you afterward. 7:30 reservation at Bellamy's still stands if you are interested." Claire glanced toward Adrian again. He stood completely still beside the windows overlooking Manhattan, one hand resting against his jaw like he was forcing himself not to react. She started softly. Before she could finish, Adrian suddenly spoke without turning around. "Claire is not available tonight." Silence crashed through the room instantly. Even Lucas sounded stunned through the phone. Claire stared at Adrian in disbelief. Slowly, Adrian turned around to face her again. His composure remained perfectly calm. But his eyes no longer did. Because she is attending the gala with me. The silence after Adrian's words felt almost unreal. Claire stood frozen beside the conference table with her phone still pressed against her ear while Lucas Hale remained completely quiet on the other end of the call. Adrian Vaughn did not break eye contact with her for even a second. "Claire?" Lucas finally said carefully. Claire blinked, trying to recover. I should call you back." She ended the call before he could answer. The room remained painfully still afterward. Adrian looked calm again on the surface, but Claire could feel tension radiating from him beneath that billionaire composure he wore so perfectly for the rest of the world. "You cannot just decide my evening plans for me," she said softly. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. "You were hesitating. That does not mean you get to answer for me." Adrian looked away briefly, almost frustrated with himself now. "You are right." The quick apology caught her off guard. Men like Adrian rarely apologize to anyone. Claire studied him carefully. "Then why did you do it?" Adrian loosened a cufflink slowly, avoiding her eyes for the first time in days. "Because the idea of you going to dinner with him bothered me more than it should." The honesty in his voice made her heartbeat stumble again. Before Claire could answer, one of the event coordinators rushed into the conference room carrying garment bags and a clipboard. "Mr. Vaughn, the press line starts in 20 minutes. She stopped abruptly after sensing the strange tension in the room. Adrian immediately shifted back into CEO mode. Cold. Controlled. Untouchable. "Understood," he replied calmly. "We will be downstairs shortly." The coordinator nodded nervously and disappeared again. Claire exhaled quietly once they were alone. "You make people nervous without even trying." Adrian glanced toward her. "You are not nervous." Claire gave him a faint smile. "Maybe I should be." Something softened in Adrian's expression again before he looked toward the black satin dress hanging beside the table. "You should change before the photographers arrive." 20 minutes later, the grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel glittered beneath crystal chandeliers and golden candlelight. The annual Vaughn Global Foundation Gala had transformed into the social event of the season. Cameras flashed nonstop near the entrance while reporters chased politicians and celebrities across the marble floors. Claire stepped out of the elevator beside Adrian and immediately felt hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Adrian wore power naturally. Wealth. Confidence. Control. The entire room shifted around him the moment he entered. But tonight something felt different. Because instead of walking 3 steps behind him like always, Claire stood beside him. Equal. The black satin dress fit her perfectly, elegant and understated, the silver necklace at her throat catching soft reflections from the ballroom lights. Adrian noticed several men staring immediately. He hated every single one of them. "Relax," Claire whispered beside him without looking up. Adrian kept his gaze forward. "I am perfectly relaxed." Claire almost laughed. "You just shook hands with a senator while glaring at a hedge fund manager." Adrian lowered his voice slightly. "He was staring at you." Claire looked up at him then, genuinely stunned by how little he seemed to care about hiding it anymore. Across the ballroom, Lucas Hale approached with 2 champagne glasses in hand. "There you are," he said smoothly. His eyes landed briefly on Claire before he smiled. "You look incredible tonight." Adrian's expression darkened instantly. Claire accepted the champagne carefully. "Thank you, Lucas." Lucas glanced between them with obvious curiosity. "I have worked with Adrian for years and this is the first gala where he has voluntarily brought someone." Adrian answered before Claire could. "Claire attends every gala." "Not like this," Lucas replied quietly. Adrian went still. Because Lucas was right. Tonight felt dangerously close to personal. The orchestra music swelled softly through the ballroom, while cameras flashed nearby. Claire looked between the 2 men, suddenly aware of the invisible tension tightening around them again. Then Lucas extended his hand toward her with an easy smile. "Dance with me before the charity speeches trap us for an hour?" Claire hesitated instinctively. And Adrian noticed immediately. His eyes dropped toward Lucas's outstretched hand before slowly lifting back toward Claire. The jealousy in his expression this time was impossible to hide. Claire looked at Lucas's outstretched hand, then instinctively toward Adrian. The ballroom lights shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble, while the orchestra played softly in the background, but suddenly none of the noise mattered anymore. Adrian Vaughn stood beside her perfectly still, one hand resting in his pocket, his expression calm enough to fool everyone except her. Claire could see it now. The tension in his jaw. The storm hidden behind his eyes. He was waiting to see what she would choose. Lucas smiled patiently. "It is one dance, Bennett. I promise not to step on your feet." Claire let out a small nervous laugh before slowly placing her champagne glass onto a passing tray. "Okay," she said softly. Adrian's gaze darkened instantly. Claire barely noticed at first because Lucas gently led her toward the center of the ballroom where dozens of couples already moved beneath golden chandeliers and floating candlelight. But Adrian noticed everything. He noticed Lucas placing a careful hand against Claire's waist. He noticed the way Claire smiled politely when Lucas spoke close to her ear over the music. And most dangerously of all, he noticed how every man in the ballroom seemed to look at her tonight. Adrian reached for another glass of whiskey from a passing server even though he rarely drank at events anymore. Across the room, several executives approached him for conversation, but he barely heard a single word they said. His entire focus remained trapped on the dance floor. Claire looked beautiful when she laughed. He hated that realization because it made him feel weak in ways he had spent years avoiding. "You are staring holes through me from across the room," Lucas murmured lightly while dancing with Claire. Claire blinked. "What?" Lucas tilted his head subtly toward Adrian standing near the ballroom windows. "Your boss." Claire glanced over instinctively. Adrian's eyes met hers immediately from across the crowded room. Neither of them looked away. Lucas gave a quiet laugh under his breath. "Okay. So I was definitely right." Claire frowned slightly. "About what?" "That man is losing his mind over you." Her heartbeat stumbled again. "You are imagining things." "Claire," Lucas said gently, "I work with billionaires for a living. Most of them barely notice normal human emotions. Adrian Vaughn looks one bad decision away from dragging you out of this ballroom himself." Claire immediately looked back toward Adrian again. The orchestra music softened into a slower melody, while cameras flashed nearby. Adrian still had not moved from his place near the windows. But his attention had never left her for even a second. Suddenly the room felt too warm. Too crowded. Too intense. "Excuse me," Claire whispered softly before stepping away from the dance floor. Lucas let her go easily, though his knowing smile remained. Claire crossed the ballroom quickly toward the quieter terrace hallway outside the main event room. Cool night air drifted through the open balcony doors overlooking Manhattan, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and rain-soaked streets below. She pressed a hand lightly against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "Running away?" Adrian's voice came from behind her only seconds later. Of course he followed her. Claire turned slowly. Adrian stood near the doorway with his tie loosened slightly now, his whiskey glass untouched in one hand. "I needed air," she replied quietly. Adrian stepped closer. "You seemed comfortable enough a minute ago." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "Are you seriously jealous of a dance?" Adrian gave a short, humorless laugh. "I am jealous of the way he looks at you." Silence fell heavily between them. The city lights reflected softly across Adrian's face while the ballroom music faded behind the closed doors. Claire swallowed carefully. "Why?" she whispered. Adrian opened his mouth, then stopped himself. Years of emotional control fought visibly behind his eyes. Claire stepped closer slowly until only a few feet separated them now. "Adrian," she said softly, "what are we doing?" He looked at her like she was the only thing grounding him to reality anymore. "I do not know," he admitted quietly. "That is the problem." Claire's heart ached unexpectedly at the honesty in his voice. The most powerful man she had ever known suddenly looked exhausted. Vulnerable. Human. Adrian stared at her for several long seconds before speaking again in a lower voice. But every time another man touches you. His jaw tightened slightly. It feels wrong. Claire stopped breathing for a moment. And somewhere inside the glowing Manhattan skyline behind them, Adrian Vaughn finally realized he was already far too in love to walk away now. Claire stared at him beneath the glow of the Manhattan skyline, her heartbeat loud enough to drown out the orchestra music still drifting faintly from the ballroom behind them. Adrian Vaughn had spent years speaking in numbers, contracts, and carefully controlled sentences. But tonight every wall around him seemed to crack apart piece by piece. It feels wrong. The words lingered heavily between them while cool night air moved softly across the terrace. Claire searched his face carefully, almost like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. Not the cold CEO employees feared. Just a man standing in front of her looking completely lost over feelings he never planned to have. "Adrian," she whispered softly, "you are scaring me a little." His expression shifted instantly. "I would never hurt you." "I know," Claire replied quickly. "That is not what I mean." She looked down briefly, gathering courage before meeting his eyes again. "You are finally saying things I spent 3 years pretending I did not want to hear." Adrian went completely still. The city lights reflected across his face while realization slowly settled into his expression. "You wanted to hear them?" Claire laughed softly under her breath, almost embarrassed now. "Do you honestly think you were the only one struggling here?" Adrian stared at her like the world had tilted beneath his feet. Claire crossed her arms lightly against the cold breeze and looked out over the glowing streets below. "You were impossible to read," she admitted quietly. "Some days I thought you trusted me more than anyone in your life. Other days you barely looked at me." Adrian stepped closer carefully. "I looked at you all the time." Claire's breath caught slightly at the quiet confession. Adrian exhaled slowly before speaking again, his voice rougher now. "I just did not allow myself to think too hard about why." Silence wrapped around them again, but this time it felt softer. Warmer. Honest. Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted as someone began the charity auction presentation, but neither of them moved. Neither cared. Claire studied him carefully. "Why now?" Adrian frowned slightly. "What do you mean? Why are you finally admitting this now?" Adrian looked down briefly before answering with brutal honesty. "Because seeing someone else with you made me realize how much I had already lost control." Claire swallowed hard. Adrian gave a faint bitter smile. "I built my entire life around never needing anyone." His eyes lifted back toward hers slowly. "Then somehow you became part of every single day without me noticing." Claire felt her chest ache unexpectedly. Adrian continued quietly. "You are the first person I look for every morning. The only person who tells me when I need to eat or sleep. The only person who walks into my office without making it feel empty afterward." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And apparently I lose my mind when another man makes you smile." Claire could not stop smiling now, even though emotion burned behind her eyes. "You are unbelievably bad at this." To her surprise, Adrian smiled too. Small. Real. Beautiful enough to make her heart completely give up trying to stay logical. "I know," he admitted quietly. For a moment they simply stood there together beneath the glowing skyline, while years of unspoken tension settled into something gentler between them. Then Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and carefully pulled out something small. Claire frowned in confusion until he placed it softly into her hand. A tiny folded yellow sticky note. Claire unfolded it slowly and immediately recognized her own handwriting. "Do not forget lunch today. You skipped dinner yesterday too." Claire looked up in shock. "You kept this?" Adrian nodded once. "You leave notes like that everywhere." His gaze softened. "I kept all of them." Her heart completely melted then. Because suddenly she understood. Adrian Vaughn had been falling in love quietly for years without even realizing it himself. Claire stepped closer until barely inches separated them now. "So what happens next?" she whispered. Adrian looked at her for several long seconds before answering softly. Honestly? Claire nodded. Adrian's eyes warmed in a way she had never seen before. I stopped pretending you are just my employee. And for the first time since she walked into Vaughn Global 3 years earlier, Claire Bennett kissed him like he finally belonged to her too.